There is a world that existed between 145 million years ago and 66 million years ago. A world so long in duration that it contains within it the entire history of mammals, the entire history of birds, the entire history of primates, and still has tens of millions of years left over. A world that ended in a way so abrupt and so complete that it changed forever the course of life on this planet. Tonight we are going to enter that world. Tonight we travel to the Cretaceous. If the Jurassic was the period of the giants, the Cretaceous was the period of transformation. Everything changed in the Cretaceous, and it changed in ways that still define the planet we inhabit today. Flowers appeared for the first time. Bees appeared. Forests ceased to be only conifers and ferns and filled with oak trees, magnolias, plane trees, plants that produced fruits and seeds wrapped in structures that attracted animals to disperse them. The world became more colorful, noisier, more complex in its interactions. And in the midst of all that change, dinosaurs continued to dominate, producing in the Cretaceous some of their most extraordinary forms, strangest and most powerful, before it all ended in a geological instant that still resonates in the world we live in today. Get comfortable. Let darkness be the background against which these images form. We move slowly, without hurry, because the Cretaceous lasted 79 million years and deserves to be traversed with the calm that everything deserves that lasted so long. The Cretaceous began where the Jurassic left off. The continents continued to separate, the Atlantic continued to widen, the interior seas continued to cover parts of the continents that are now dry land. But the pace of these changes accelerated during the Cretaceous in ways that were perceptible on the geological timescale. The South Atlantic opened during the early Cretaceous, definitively separating Africa from South America and creating the ocean that today separates two worlds that were once one. India, which had been part of the supercontinent Gondwana along with Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, separated and began its long journey northward, a journey that would last tens of millions of years and would end with its collision against Asia to form the Himalayas, though that would occur long after the Cretaceous. Sea level in the Cretaceous was the highest in the past 500 million years. Higher than in the Jurassic, higher than in any other period that we can reconstruct with reliable data. It is estimated that the average sea level during the Cretaceous was between 100 and 200 meters higher than current levels, which means that enormous portions of the current continents were underwater. North America was divided in two by a shallow interior sea called the Western Interior Sea, which extended from what is today the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic, dividing the continent into two separate landmasses for much of the period. Europe was an archipelago of islands surrounded by warm seas. Much of what is now Western Russia was underwater. The map of the world in the Cretaceous was unrecognizable compared to today's. That high sea level was not just a geographical curiosity. It had profound climatic consequences. The shallow seas that covered the continents absorbed solar heat during summer and released it slowly during winter, softening thermal extremes and producing a more uniform climate at latitudes that today experience pronounced seasons. The Cretaceous was generally a warm period, with global temperatures 4 to 10 degrees higher than the current ones, without permanent polar ice caps, with forests extending to latitudes that today are covered in tundra. The North Pole of the Cretaceous had forests. The Cretaceous Antarctic, although cold, was not covered in permanent ice and harbored vegetation and dinosaurs. Carbon dioxide in the Cretaceous atmosphere was at concentrations several times higher than today's, acting as the blanket that maintained that global heat. The massive volcanic eruptions that occurred during the Cretaceous, especially those associated with the formation of large volcanic provinces like the oceanic basaltic plateaus of the Caribbean and Kerguelen, released enormous quantities of this gas into the atmosphere periodically, producing pulses of warming that were superimposed on the already warm background of the period. In that warm and humid world, with seas covering parts of the continents and with an atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide, life flourished with an exuberance that is difficult to imagine from our current perspective. And in that setting, the dinosaurs that had dominated the Jurassic continued to dominate, but in new forms, producing in the Cretaceous a diversity that far exceeded that of the previous period. The great revolution of the Cretaceous did not occur in the sky, nor in the sea, nor among the great predators. It occurred in the soil, in the biology of plants, and transformed the world in a way that we still live today every time we see a flower, smell a rose, or eat a fruit. Flowering plants, angiosperms, appeared in the fossil record during the early Cretaceous, approximately 130 million years ago. They did not emerge fully formed out of nothing. Their ancestors were already present in the Jurassic in forms that paleobotanists still debate, and the transition was gradual. But the point at which angiosperms become recognizable as such, with their flowers, their fruits, and their seeds wrapped up, that point is in the early Cretaceous. What followed was one of the fastest diversifications in the history of life on Earth. In the early Cretaceous, angiosperms were a botanical curiosity, small herbaceous plants that grew in the wet margins of rivers and swamps, dominating no ecosystem. By the end of the Cretaceous, they had conquered virtually every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet and had diversified into thousands of different forms that included large trees, shrubs, grasses, vines, and aquatic plants. It was the fastest plant diversification that the fossil record has documented so far. Why were they so successful? The answer lies in the flower itself. A flower is, in essence, an advertisement directed at an animal. It says, "Here is food, come and find it, and while you do, carry my pollen grains to the next flower." It is a reproduction system that depends on animal intermediaries and in exchange for that service offers nectar, which is concentrated energy, or pollen, which is protein. The insects that evolved to exploit those resources became the most efficient vectors of reproduction that plants had ever had, and plants that produced more attractive flowers, more nutritious or easier to access, had more reproductive success than those that did not. Bees, butterflies, pollinating beetles, all of them diversified during the Cretaceous in parallel with angiosperms, in one of the most spectacular coevolutions in the history of life. Each new type of flower that evolved created an opportunity for a new type of specialized pollinator. Each new type of pollinator created a selective pressure that pushed flowers toward new forms and new colors. It was an arms race of beauty and mutualism that in 79 million years produced the diversity of flowers and pollinating insects that fills the world today. Fruits were the other great innovation of the angiosperms. A seed wrapped in nutritious fleshy tissue is a seed that animals consume willingly. They carry it in their intestines for hours or days, and they deposit it far from the parent plant along with a small amount of fertilizer. It was a seed dispersal strategy that surpassed in efficiency everything that flowerless plants had been able to develop before, and that allowed angiosperms to colonize new territories with a speed that conifers and ferns could not match. The Cretaceous was not a world of uniform conditions. The period lasted 79 million years, and during that time the planet changed. Continents continued to move. Sea levels rose and fell. The climate fluctuated between warmer and slightly cooler periods, though it remained warm in absolute terms compared to today. And with each environmental shift, the ecosystems changed in response, and the life forms that dominated shifted with them. One of the biggest changes during the Cretaceous was the progressive cooling of the poles. Early in the Cretaceous, it is believed that both poles were ice-free, and the climate was warmest. As the Cretaceous progressed, the Arctic ice became more extensive, although the Antarctic did not develop permanent ice sheets. The Southern Ocean, the cold water that surrounded Antarctica, began to develop the characteristics that would make it the coldest ocean on Earth, though the ice sheets would not fully form until after the Cretaceous had ended. This gradual cooling had a selective effect. Organisms that could tolerate warmer conditions would gradually lose territory to organisms that could tolerate colder conditions. In the shallow seas that covered parts of the continents, certain species of cephalopods and fish became more common in the higher latitudes. In the terrestrial ecosystems, the floral composition changed. The tropical plants of the early Cretaceous were replaced in the higher latitudes by plants that were more cold-tolerant. The dinosaurs adapted to these gradual changes, developing new forms that were suited to the new conditions. But the story of the Cretaceous is not primarily a story of gradual change. It is a story of explosive diversification punctuated by regional catastrophes. The Cretaceous saw the emergence of new groups of dinosaurs, each one with distinct adaptations to the environments they inhabited. The sauropods, the massive long-necked dinosaurs, continued from the Jurassic, but became less diverse as the period progressed. The theropods diversified explosively, giving rise to smaller, faster predators and to the first birds. The ceratopsians, the dinosaurs with horns and frills, appeared and diversified rapidly. The ankylosaurs and the ornithopods also appeared and became increasingly common. Each of these groups had its own success story, its own period of explosive growth and diversification, followed by periods of stability or decline. The story of the Cretaceous, told in detail, is not the story of a single world but of dozens of worlds, each one existing briefly before being replaced by another. The Earth of the early Cretaceous was so different from the Earth of the late Cretaceous that if you could be transported instantly from one to the other, you might not immediately recognize them as the same period. Let's talk about the predators of the Cretaceous, because they are the dinosaurs that capture our imagination most powerfully. The largest and most fearsome of these predators was Tyrannosaurus rex, which appeared toward the end of the Cretaceous period, in the last few million years before the extinction. Tyrannosaurus was not the largest theropod predator that ever lived, but it was probably the most powerful. It weighed around 9,000 kilograms, stood about 4 meters tall at the hips, and stretched about 12 meters from snout to tail. It had a bite force that was probably the strongest of any animal that has ever existed. But Tyrannosaurus was not alone. There were other large predators in the Cretaceous, some that appeared earlier and declined before Tyrannosaurus rose to dominance. Spinosaurus, which lived in what is now North Africa, was possibly even larger than Tyrannosaurus, with a distinctive sail on its back made of elongated spinal processes covered in skin. The sail may have been used for display, or for thermoregulation, or for attracting mates. We do not know for certain, because we know Spinosaurus only from fossils, and fossils are silent about behavior. There were also the abelisaurs, a group of large theropods that dominated in the southern continents when they began to separate from Gondwana. Carnotaurus was one of the abelisaurs, distinctive for the pair of thick horns on its head, short arms, and a powerfully built body adapted for short bursts of speed. There was Giganotosaurus, which was larger than Tyrannosaurus and which prowled the forests and plains of what is now South America during the Cretaceous. What all of these predators had in common was that they were apex predators, animals at the top of the food chain in their ecosystems. They had few natural enemies. They shaped the behavior and distribution of all the herbivorous dinosaurs in their territories. The threat of predation is a powerful selective force. It selects for faster herbivores, for better defensive strategies, for group living and vigilance behavior. The presence of these large predators shaped the entire structure of the Cretaceous ecosystems. The question of how these enormous predators hunted is one of the great mysteries of paleontology. Did they hunt alone, or did they cooperate in groups? Did they chase down prey in open running fights, or did they ambush prey and use their weight and bite force to kill quickly? Did they scavenge on kills made by other predators? The fossil record is silent. We have teeth and bones, and we can infer strength and speed. But we do not have behavior. We do not have eyes, watching how these predators took down their prey. We imagine, we extrapolate, we use modern animals as models, but we never know for sure. While the large predators roamed the continents, smaller predators dominated other ecological niches. The Cretaceous was a world where size was not the only measure of success. There were small theropods, some no larger than modern birds, that had diversified into dozens of species with different dietary specializations and hunting strategies. Some of these small theropods, the dromaeosaurs and the trudontids, had brains that were proportionally larger than those of the larger dinosaurs, suggesting intelligence and complex behavior. The dromaeosaurs are particularly interesting because they had a distinctive claw on each hind leg, an enlarged curved talon that they probably used in hunting. Fossils have been found showing dromaeosaurs clustered around prey, suggesting possible cooperative hunting. They had relatively long arms with grasping hands, and they may have used them to climb or to help subdue prey. The most famous of the dromaeosaurs is Velociraptor, which was smaller and more gracile than many people imagine. Not the bulky monster of popular culture, but a slender, fast, intelligent predator about the size of a large dog. But predators are only half of the story. For every predator, there are many prey. The Cretaceous herbivores were as diverse and as specialized as the predators. There were the sauropods, continuing from the Jurassic but becoming steadily less dominant. There were the ornithopods, medium-sized herbivores that ranged from small, bipedal forms that probably climbed in trees to large, bulky species that moved in herds across the landscape. There were the ceratopsians, a radiation of herbivores with different horn and frill configurations that made each species distinctive. The hadrosaurs, sometimes called the duckbills because of their flattened snouts, were among the most successful herbivores of the late Cretaceous. They were large, reaching up to 9 meters or more in length, and they had sophisticated teeth designed for grinding plant material. Many hadrosaurs had crests on their heads that may have been used for communication, for display, or for thermoregulation. Different species of hadrosaurs had different crest shapes, and it is possible that they could recognize each other by their crests, just as we recognize individuals by their faces. The ankylosaurs were another successful group, heavily armored herbivores covered in bone plates and spikes, with club-like tails that could be swung as weapons. The ceratopsians with their horns and frills were yet another solution to the problem of being a large herbivore in a world full of predators. Each of these groups had its own evolutionary trajectory, its own adaptations, its own period of success. The diversity of herbivores in the Cretaceous suggests that the food available in Cretaceous ecosystems was abundant and varied. The landscape was not a monotonous expanse of one type of plant. Instead, it was a patchwork of different habitats, different vegetation types, each one offering different food resources and requiring different feeding strategies to exploit. This heterogeneity of resources is what drove the diversification of herbivores, just as the abundance of herbivores drove the diversification of predators. But the animals we see in the fossil record are not the whole story. Fossils are biased toward animals that are large, that have bones or shells, that die in the right place at the right time to be buried and preserved. The vast majority of animals that existed in the Cretaceous left no fossil record. The smaller they are, the less likely they are to be fossilized. The softer their bodies, the less likely they are to leave a trace. And so the Cretaceous that we see in the fossil record is only a partial view, a biased sample of the actual diversity of life. But we can infer the presence of animals that left no fossils by looking at the ecological structure of the communities we can see. If there were large herbivorous dinosaurs, there must have been smaller herbivores. If there were large predators, there must have been smaller predators, and there must have been a large base of prey animals to support them. We can estimate the biomass of dinosaurs in Cretaceous ecosystems by looking at bones and teeth and drawing on studies of modern ecosystems where we can observe predator-prey ratios directly. The picture that emerges is one of abundant and diverse life. The large dinosaurs that we think of as the iconic inhabitants of the Cretaceous were probably only a small fraction of the actual biomass. The small mammals that were living in the cracks and crevices of Cretaceous worlds, hidden from predators, eating insects and seeds and small plants, probably made up a substantial portion of the actual vertebrate biomass, though they left few fossils. There were also the insects, which had diversified explosively during the Cretaceous along with the flowering plants. Beetles of every description, flies, wasps, ants. The ants, which appeared during the Cretaceous, diversified into hundreds of species by the end of the period. The bees, having co-evolved with the flowering plants, developed the sophisticated social structures and behaviors that we see in modern bees. The flying insects of the Cretaceous would have been visible everywhere, in the air above the flowering plants, a buzz and flutter that was absent from the Jurassic world. And then there were the birds, which had their origins in the Cretaceous. The early birds were small, probably still much more dinosaur-like than modern birds, with claws on their wings and teeth in their beaks. But they were birds, animals with feathers and wings and the ability to fly. They filled ecological niches that no other animals could occupy. They hunted insects in the air. They ate seeds and fruits. They nested in trees. And they evolved rapidly, producing over the course of the Cretaceous a diversity of forms that would give rise to the thousands of bird species that fly in the skies today. The oceans of the Cretaceous were as different from modern oceans as the terrestrial ecosystems were different from modern ecosystems. The marine reptiles that had dominated the Jurassic continued through the Cretaceous, but with significant changes. The ichthyosaurs declined steadily through the Cretaceous, finally disappearing about 10 million years before the end of the period. The plesiosaurs and the pliosaurs continued and even diversified, with new forms appearing that were adapted to different marine conditions. The mosasaurs appeared during the Middle Cretaceous and rapidly diversified to become the dominant large marine predators of the Late Cretaceous. Mosasaurs were lizards, distant relatives of modern monitor lizards, that had adapted to a fully aquatic life. They had streamlined bodies, powerful swimming tails, and mouths full of sharp teeth adapted for catching fish and smaller marine reptiles. The largest mosasaurs, like Mosasaurus itself, reached lengths of 15 to 18 meters, making them among the largest marine predators of all time. But the mosasaurs were not the only large predators in Cretaceous seas. There were the hybodont sharks, which were still common in Cretaceous oceans, and the first of the true modern sharks, which began to appear and diversify during the Cretaceous. Fish had diversified explosively during the Cretaceous, with the radiation of the teleosts, the modern fish with flexible jaws and swim bladders. The teleosts would come to dominate the world's oceans and are the ancestors of almost all the fish species that exist today. The shallow seas that covered the continents during the Cretaceous were teeming with life. There were ammonites, the coiled cephalopods with beautiful shells, that had diversified into hundreds of species with shells of different sizes, shapes, and ornamentations. There were the belemnites, another group of cephalopods that were also highly diverse. There were countless species of mollusks, brachiopods, and sea urchins. The fossil record from these shallow seas is incredibly rich, with layers of sediment full of shells and skeletal material, each layer representing a different time interval and a different assemblage of species. The productivity of these shallow seas was enormous. The warm water was rich in nutrients brought in by rivers from the land. The sunlight penetrated to the bottom in these relatively shallow areas, allowing photosynthetic organisms to thrive. The result was a rich food web, with producers and consumers at every level. The communities that existed in these shallow seas were some of the most complex and most diverse that any geological period has produced. The coral reefs of the Cretaceous, though different from modern coral reefs in detail, were also complex ecosystems teeming with life. The reef-building organisms of the Cretaceous were not the corals we know today, but other organisms like the rudists, bivalves with thick shells that had adapted to reef building. These Cretaceous reefs were home to fish and other marine life, just as modern reefs are, and they were important structures in Cretaceous ecosystems. Let me talk about something that dominated many Cretaceous landscapes that we have not yet discussed: the pterosaurs. These flying reptiles had originated long before the Cretaceous, back in the Triassic, and they had been successful throughout the Jurassic. But the Cretaceous was their golden age, the period of their greatest diversity and greatest size. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, though they were related to dinosaurs and lived at the same time. They were a separate evolutionary lineage, with their own adaptations to flight and their own ecological roles. Some pterosaurs were small, no larger than sparrows, with delicate bone structures adapted for flying quickly and agilely. Others were enormous. The largest pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus, had wingspans of up to 12 meters or more, making them the largest flying animals that have ever lived. How did animals as large as Quetzalcoatlus fly? The answer is that they were extremely light. Their bones were hollow, even more hollow than those of modern birds. Their bodies were streamlined and relatively small compared to their wings. They had powerful muscles for the wing stroke, but the muscles were concentrated in the chest, not distributed throughout the body as they are in modern birds. When you do the calculations, taking into account their weight, their wing area, and the requirements for generating lift, Quetzalcoatlus would have been capable of flight, though perhaps not the agile, quick flight that smaller pterosaurs achieved. Where did these pterosaurs hunt? Many of them, particularly the large ones, probably hunted over water, looking for fish. Some of them, like the toothless pterosaurs that appeared in the late Cretaceous, may have hunted small mammals or insects. The fact that there was such a diversity of pterosaur sizes and shapes suggests that they exploited a range of different food resources and ecological niches. Each size and shape would have been optimized for hunting a particular type of prey in a particular way. The pterosaurs disappeared at the same time as the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous. Their end is sometimes attributed to competition with birds, the theory being that as birds became more diverse and more specialized, they outcompete pterosaurs for the available food resources. But this is speculative. The extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous was so severe that it eliminated most large animals regardless of their type. The pterosaurs were probably casualties of that same event that killed the dinosaurs, not the victims of gradual replacement by a superior competitor. Now let's talk about plants and the botanical revolution that the Cretaceous represented. We mentioned angiosperms earlier, but their impact deserves deeper consideration. The appearance of flowering plants changed not just the appearance of the world but the entire structure of terrestrial ecosystems. Before the Cretaceous, the plants that dominated terrestrial ecosystems were conifers, ferns, cycads, and a few other non-flowering types. These plants had various mechanisms for reproduction, some using spores, some using seeds, but none of them had flowers. They were pollinated by wind or water, or they spread their spores through the air. The landscapes of the Jurassic would have been dominated by green, but a green broken only by the occasional fruiting structure that would be visible as anything other than leaves and branches. The angiosperms introduced color to the landscape. They also introduced a new kind of interaction between plants and animals. The flowering plants did not just rely on animals to pollinate them. Many flowering plants also evolved fruits that were designed to be eaten. The flesh of the fruit attracted animals. The seeds inside were protected but ultimately dispersed. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The animal got nutrition from the fruit, and the plant got its seeds dispersed. This innovation had a cascading effect through ecosystems. The insects that fed on flowers diversified. The dinosaurs and other animals that fed on fruits and seeds diversified. The entire structure of food webs began to shift. The introduction of flowering plants was not a gradual process. It was a relatively rapid diversification that happened over the first 20 to 30 million years of the Cretaceous. But the flowering plants did not immediately replace the non-flowering plants. The Cretaceous world was a mixed world, with both flowering and non-flowering plants coexisting. The conifers never disappeared. The ferns are still here today. But the flowering plants came to dominate, especially in warmer and more humid environments. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants had become common in most terrestrial ecosystems, though conifers remained dominant in some regions, particularly in the higher latitudes and in drier areas. The diversity of flowers that evolved was astonishing. Early in the Cretaceous, flowers were simple, with relatively few petals and relatively undifferentiated structures. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowers had evolved into the bewildering variety of shapes, sizes, and colors that we see today. There were flowers with composite structures made of hundreds of tiny flowers clustered together. There were flowers with individual petals arranged in spirals or in whorls. There were flowers with fused petals forming tubes, flowers designed to attract hummingbirds or bats or flying insects of every description. The coevolution of flowering plants with their pollinators produced some of the most intricate and beautiful biological systems that nature has ever produced. A flower and its pollinator are locked in an evolutionary dance, each shaping the other, producing forms that are so specialized that they seem designed just for each other. Let me tell you about the early mammals of the Cretaceous, because while the dinosaurs were getting all the glory, small mammals were quietly radiating into new forms and starting to explore new ecological niches. The mammals that existed during the Jurassic and early Cretaceous were small, mostly mouse to rat-sized, living in the shadows of the dinosaurs. But during the Cretaceous, some mammals began to grow larger. Some developed specialized teeth for eating different types of food. Some probably became burrowers, digging holes and living underground where they were safe from predators. Some became gliders, developing membranes of skin stretched between legs to allow them to jump from tree to tree. The most successful mammals of the Cretaceous were still small, but they were beginning to diversify in interesting ways. Some were carnivorous, hunting insects and small vertebrates. Some were herbivorous, eating plants and seeds. Some were omnivorous, eating whatever they could find. This dietary diversity allowed different mammal groups to exploit different resources and to coexist in the same ecosystem. What is remarkable about the Cretaceous mammals is how different they were from modern mammals. None of the major groups of modern mammals had appeared yet. There were no primates, no rodents, no bats, no whales, no hoofed animals. There were only the early representatives of the more basal groups, animals whose relationships to modern mammals are not always clear, and who occupied ecological niches that are no longer occupied by any modern animal. The mammals of the Cretaceous were set to inherit the world. When the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous removed the dinosaurs, the mammals were there, small and relatively unspecialized by modern standards, but capable of rapid evolution and adaptation. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, they would begin to diversify explosively, evolving into the shapes and sizes and ecological roles that we see today. But for all of the Cretaceous, they were minor players, bit actors in a drama dominated by dinosaurs. This is an important lesson about evolution and about change. The future does not necessarily belong to the dominant species of the present. It belongs to those groups that can adapt to the new conditions that emerge. The dinosaurs were the dominant vertebrates of the Cretaceous, but they were specialized for a particular set of conditions. When those conditions changed radically at the end of the Cretaceous, that specialization became a liability. The mammals, with their generally smaller size and their more generalized body plans, were better able to cope with the new conditions that emerged. Within a few million years of the extinction, mammals had diversified into forms that occupied all the large body sizes and many of the ecological roles that dinosaurs had formerly occupied. Now I want to talk about the Cretaceous in a way that brings it closer to us by discussing the animals that lived then that are most closely related to animals that live now. The most obvious of these are the birds. The earliest known bird, Archaeopteryx, is from the Jurassic, but birds really began to diversify during the Cretaceous. The birds of the early Cretaceous were still quite dinosaur-like, with teeth in their beaks and claws on their wings. But they were birds, with feathers and the ability to fly. As the Cretaceous progressed, birds became more specialized. Different groups evolved different feeding strategies. Some became insectivores, snatching insects from the air or picking them off plants. Some became piscivores, diving into water to catch fish. Some became seed-eaters, cracking seeds with powerful beaks. Some became scavengers or omnivores. By the end of the Cretaceous, birds had diversified into hundreds of species with different sizes, different diets, different behaviors. Many of the birds of the Cretaceous are extinct, but some modern bird groups had their origins in the Cretaceous. The living birds that we see today, the chickens and the eagles and the parrots and the swallows and the hummingbirds and thousands of others, they are all descendants of birds that originated in the Cretaceous and then survived the extinction event at the end of the period. When the extinction came, the birds that survived were generally small and adaptable. These early survivors gave rise, in the millions of years following the extinction, to all of the modern bird diversity that we see today. The reptiles that survived the extinction are also with us today. The crocodilians, which were common in Cretaceous oceans and rivers, survived and continue to the present day. The lizards, which had diversified during the Cretaceous, survived and diversified further. The snakes, which originated during the Cretaceous, survived and became one of the most successful groups of modern reptiles. The turtles, which had originated even earlier, continued through the Cretaceous extinction and are still common today. So when we look at the reptiles and birds of today, we are looking at the descendants of animals that lived through the Cretaceous and survived the extinction. The Cretaceous is not simply a dead past that we study in fossils. It is the parent of our present, the period that gave rise to the animals that we share our world with today. The animals of the Cretaceous were not so different from the animals of today that we cannot relate to them. We share basic body plans with the dinosaurs. We share basic metabolic processes with them. We share basic behaviors with them. The differences are in the details, in the sizes, in the specific adaptations. But the commonality is profound. Every animal alive today is descended from animals that survived the Cretaceous extinction. Every animal alive today is therefore a type of dinosaur, in the sense that dinosaurs are the ancestor group from which all modern birds and reptiles are descended. In a real sense, dinosaurs did not go extinct. They transformed. Let me talk about the climate of the Cretaceous in more detail, because understanding the climate is key to understanding why the Cretaceous ecosystems were so rich and so diverse. The Cretaceous was warmer than today, but it was not uniformly warm. There were fluctuations. During the early Cretaceous, it is believed that global temperatures were around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius higher than today. During the late Cretaceous, they may have cooled somewhat, to perhaps 5 to 10 degrees higher than today. These temperatures are still significantly warmer than today, but they show that the climate did fluctuate within the overall warm baseline of the period. One reason for the warmth was the elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The Cretaceous atmosphere may have had concentrations of carbon dioxide as high as 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million, compared to about 420 today. That higher carbon dioxide would have created a stronger greenhouse effect, trapping more heat and leading to the warmer global temperatures. Why was there so much carbon dioxide in the Cretaceous atmosphere? Part of the answer is volcanic activity. The Cretaceous was a period of intense volcanism, with massive volcanic eruptions releasing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. Part of the answer is that there was less vegetation to absorb carbon dioxide and convert it to oxygen than there is today. The flowering plants had not yet achieved dominance everywhere, and the landscapes had fewer trees, fewer plants overall. Less plant biomass meant less absorption of carbon dioxide, which meant more carbon dioxide remained in the atmosphere. The high carbon dioxide and the resulting warmth had consequences for weather patterns. The equator-to-pole temperature gradient was less steep than it is today. The poles were warmer, reducing the temperature difference between the equator and the poles. This temperature difference is a major driver of atmospheric circulation and ocean currents. A smaller temperature gradient means different wind and current patterns. The jet streams, the fast-flowing rivers of air in the upper atmosphere that drive much of the weather in the middle latitudes, would have had different positions and different strengths. Hurricanes and other tropical storms would have had different frequencies and trajectories. The effect of all of this would have been to produce a climate that was more uniform globally than the climate today. The tropics would have been tropical, the poles would have been warm temperate or subtropical rather than frozen. The rain that falls on the equator would have been distributed differently, with different regions receiving different amounts of moisture. But overall, the climate would have been more stable than the chaotic climate of today, with less year-to-year variation in temperature and precipitation. However, this does not mean the Cretaceous climate was perfectly stable. There were shorter-term fluctuations, orbital variations that caused the climate to cycle on timescales of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, similar to the Ice Age cycles of the Quaternary. There were volcanic eruptions that could cause temporary cooling lasting a few years. There were El Niño-like oscillations in ocean temperature and circulation that would have caused regional droughts and floods. The climate was stable in the long term but variable in the short term, which is the typical pattern for most of Earth's climatic history. One of the most interesting questions about the Cretaceous is how the tropical heat would have affected the metabolism and behavior of dinosaurs. Modern reptiles are cold-blooded, meaning they depend on the external environment to regulate their body temperature. When it is cold, they become sluggish. When it is warm, they become active. How did dinosaurs thermoregulate? The answer is probably complicated and probably varied between different dinosaur groups. Some paleontologists argue that large dinosaurs, by virtue of their size, would have had thermal inertia. They would have cooled and heated slowly, maintaining a relatively stable body temperature even without active thermoregulation, just because of their large thermal mass. A 30-ton animal takes a long time to heat up or cool down. If the Cretaceous climate was warm and stable, with little seasonal variation, such an animal might maintain a reasonably constant body temperature with minimal metabolic cost. Other paleontologists argue that at least some dinosaurs were warm-blooded or heterothermic, capable of generating heat through metabolism in a way similar to modern birds and mammals. The evidence for this comes from several sources. Bone structure that suggests active metabolism, resting metabolic rates estimated from bone histology, the apparent activity levels inferred from behavior, the presence of growth rates that seem incompatible with cold blood ectothermy. The truth is probably that different dinosaur groups had different thermoregulatory strategies. Small dinosaurs probably could not rely on thermal inertia and may have needed active thermoregulation to maintain their activity levels. Large dinosaurs might have been ectothermic in the sense that they relied on the environment to regulate their temperature, but they might have done behavioral thermoregulation, basking in the sun to warm up or seeking shade to cool down. The Cretaceous warmth would have had an interesting effect on thermoregulation strategies. In a warm climate with little seasonal variation, the energy cost of thermoregulation would have been lower than in a climate with cold winters. Ectothermic animals would have been active for more of the year. Endothermic animals would not have needed to expend as much energy keeping warm. The favorable climate would have supported a rich fauna without requiring the most energy-efficient thermoregulation. What this means is that the Cretaceous climate was not just favorable for life in general, but it was specifically favorable for large animals. The abundance of large dinosaurs in the Cretaceous is in part a consequence of the warm climate and the abundant food resources that the climate supported. Let's talk about the end of the Cretaceous, because the end of this period is one of the most famous and most studied extinction events in the history of life. This is where the story of the Cretaceous reaches its climax and its conclusion. For most of the Cretaceous, life flourished. The dinosaurs were diverse and abundant. The pterosaurs dominated the skies. The marine reptiles dominated the seas. The flowering plants had conquered the terrestrial ecosystems. Life was rich, complex, abundant. And then, at the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, something happened that nearly destroyed all of this. An asteroid, estimated to be between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter, struck the Earth in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact was catastrophic. The energy released was equivalent to the explosion of millions of nuclear weapons. The asteroid vaporized on impact, creating a blast that incinerated everything within hundreds of kilometers. Earthquakes of enormous magnitude rocked the Earth. Massive tsunami waves swept across the oceans. Soot and ash and dust were thrown into the upper atmosphere, so much material that sunlight was blocked and the world entered a kind of twilight lasting for months or possibly longer. Without sunlight, photosynthesis ceased. Plants died. The herbivores that depended on plants had no food. The predators that depended on herbivores had no food. The food chains that had taken millions of years to build collapsed in weeks or months. Most large animals died. In the oceans, the plankton that formed the base of the food chain were particularly hard hit. The extinction cascaded through ecosystems like dominoes falling. When the dust settled and the sky cleared and sunlight returned, the world was changed forever. About 70 to 75% of all species on Earth had died. The dinosaurs were gone, all of them except for their descendants, which we now call birds. The pterosaurs were gone. The marine reptiles were gone. Many lineages of mammals were gone. Many plant species were gone. The ecological structures that had existed throughout the Cretaceous were shattered. But not everything died. Some plants survived. Some mammals survived. Some birds survived. Some fish survived. Some insects survived. Life, resilient and adaptable, persisted. And from that persistence came new diversification, new adaptation, new evolutionary trajectories. The extinction event was a reset button, a moment when the rules of ecology changed abruptly, when the old strategies for survival no longer worked and new strategies had to emerge. I want to talk about what the evidence tells us about this extinction event, because the story of how we came to understand it is a story of how science works. The evidence for the asteroid impact is overwhelming. At the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, there is a thin layer of sediment that contains a spike of iridium, a metal that is rare in Earth's crust but common in meteorites. The layer also contains shocked quartz crystals, quartz that has been subjected to such high pressure that its crystal structure is deformed, something that only happens from impacts or nuclear explosions. The layer contains soot, evidence of massive wildfires. The layer contains spherules, tiny glass beads that would have formed from the vaporized asteroid material. The impact crater itself was eventually found beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, buried under younger sediments. The crater is called Chicxulub. It is about 180 kilometers in diameter. The age of the crater matches the age of the extinction event almost exactly. All of this evidence converges on the same conclusion. An asteroid struck the Earth at the end of the Cretaceous and caused an extinction event. But this was not obvious immediately. When the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was first recognized in the 19th century, it was attributed to gradual climate change or to the competition from mammals. The dinosaurs were simply outcompete and faded away. This was the consensus view for a long time. Then, in the 1970s, Luis Alvarez, his son Walter Alvarez, and their colleagues discovered the iridium spike. They proposed the asteroid impact hypothesis to explain the extinction. This was controversial. Many scientists were skeptical. The idea that a single event could cause such massive extinction seemed improbable, contrary to the gradualism that had dominated geology for over a century. But the evidence accumulated. More iridium spikes were found at other locations around the world, all from the same age. The shock quartz was found. The soot was found. The crater was found. Gradually, the evidence became overwhelming, and the scientific consensus shifted. What had once seemed implausible became the accepted explanation. This is how science works. A new idea is proposed. It is met with skepticism. Evidence is gathered. If the evidence supports the idea, the consensus gradually shifts. If new evidence contradicts the idea, it is modified or abandoned. The truth emerges not through the force of argument but through the accumulation and testing of evidence. The asteroid impact hypothesis is now so well established that it is difficult to remember how controversial it once was. This is a reminder that the things we think of as settled facts of science were once ideas that had to be tested and proven. And conversely, the ideas that seem implausible to us now might be established facts in the future, when more evidence has been gathered. Let's talk about the extinction itself, about which dinosaurs died and which survived, and why the pattern of extinction was what it was. The extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was selective in some ways. All non-avian dinosaurs died. All pterosaurs died. All marine reptiles died. But some dinosaurs survived. The ones that survived were birds, and they were generally small. The largest bird that survived the extinction was probably no bigger than a modern chicken. Most of the birds that survived were smaller, perhaps parrot-sized or hawk-sized. Why did the birds survive when all the other large dinosaurs died? One possibility is that small animals require less food than large animals, so they were more likely to survive the period of darkness when photosynthesis had stopped and food was scarce. Another possibility is that small animals have shorter generation times, allowing them to adapt more rapidly to changing conditions. A third possibility is that birds, because they evolved from small theropod dinosaurs, had already developed many of the characteristics that would be useful for survival in a world recovering from an asteroid impact. They were already warm-blooded, already had rapid metabolisms, already had the ability to seek shelter and survive on scarce food. The mammals that survived the extinction were also generally small. Most surviving mammal species weighed less than a kilogram. The large mammals did not appear until millions of years after the extinction. The mammals that inherited the Earth did so gradually, evolving and diversifying into new forms and new sizes in the absence of the dinosaurs. The plants that survived are less well understood. The fossil record of plants is poor compared to the fossil record of large animals, and the details of which plants survived and which went extinct are unclear. But it appears that some plants in every major group survived, including conifers, flowering plants, ferns, and cycads. The surviving plants were concentrated in regions that were less affected by the impact or that had better conditions for survival, though we do not yet fully understand which regions those were. The marine life that survived the extinction is also not completely understood. The ammonites died completely. The belemnites died. The mosasaurs and other large marine reptiles died. But many fish species survived. Many shark species survived. Some marine invertebrates survived. The communities that existed in the oceans after the extinction were fundamentally different from those that existed before, with many of the dominant forms being replaced by new forms that diversified to fill the ecological roles that the extinct animals had occupied. The pattern of extinction suggests that the immediate impact and its consequences, the impact blast, the darkness, the disruption of food chains, were the primary killers. Animals that could survive a period of reduced food availability, that could shelter from the blast and the heat, that could tolerate rapid temperature swings, were more likely to survive. Large animals were at a disadvantage because they needed more food. Animals that were specialized for a particular food source were at a disadvantage if their food source was disrupted. Animals that were generalists, that could eat a variety of food sources, had a better chance of survival. Now I want to address a question that has been asked many times. Did dinosaurs really die out completely, or do they survive today? In a literal biological sense, the answer is that non-avian dinosaurs did go extinct. All of the large dinosaurs, the sauropods, the ornithopods, the ceratopsians, the theropods except for the ancestors of birds, are gone. They cannot be found alive anywhere on Earth today. They are extinct. But in an evolutionary sense, the dinosaurs did not go extinct. The birds are dinosaurs. They are the direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs. They retained the genes, the body plan, the characteristics of their dinosaur ancestors. They modified those characteristics, transformed them, adapted them to new ways of life. But they did not lose them. A chicken is a dinosaur. An eagle is a dinosaur. A sparrow is a dinosaur. When we use the term dinosaur technically, to refer to the clade that includes the theropods and the sauropods and all of their descendants, then birds are dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are not extinct. They are alive, they are diverse, they are all around us. This illustrates an important principle in evolution. Extinction is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon. A clade can lose some of its members while retaining others. The dinosaurs, as a clade, did not go extinct. The dinosaurs as we colloquially think of them, the large reptiles that dominated the terrestrial ecosystems, did go extinct. But the clade persisted in the form of birds, and from that persistence came a new radiation, a new diversification, that eventually produced the over 10,000 species of birds that exist today. This is the nature of extinction and evolution in deep time. Species go extinct. Lineages go extinct. But clades persist. And in the persistence of clades lies the possibility of new evolutionary innovation, of new adaptation, of new ways of living that emerge from the old ones. In a very real sense, we are living in the age of dinosaurs still. We are living in a world populated by dinosaurs. We just call them birds. The Cretaceous did not end the age of dinosaurs. It ended the age of large non-avian dinosaurs. But the age of dinosaurs continues, transformed and modified, expressed in feathers and flight and songs and colors and behaviors that would be unrecognizable to a time-traveling Tyrannosaurus. But dinosaurs nonetheless. Let me tell you about something that is often overlooked when discussing the Cretaceous extinction. The survival was not random. Certain groups were more likely to survive than others. Certain characteristics were more likely to be selected for survival. This is the beginning of the story of the post-Cretaceous world, the world after the dinosaurs. The characteristics that promoted survival during the extinction event were characteristics that would become increasingly important in the post-extinction world. Small size was advantageous. Ability to survive on limited food was advantageous. Capacity for rapid reproduction was advantageous. Behavioral flexibility and the ability to adapt to new conditions was advantageous. These characteristics, which had been useful for survival during the extinction event, became the foundation for the rapid radiation of the surviving groups in the millions of years that followed. The mammals that inherited the Earth were small, with rapid generation times, with the ability to exploit a variety of food sources, with warm blood that allowed them to be active in conditions where ectothermic animals might have been sluggish. The birds that inherited the sky were similarly characterized by rapid generation times, by metabolic flexibility, by the ability to exploit new food sources. These surviving groups had characteristics that made them successful not just in surviving the extinction event, but in thriving in the post-extinction world. This is one of the great lessons of the Cretaceous extinction. Extinction events are not just destructive. They are also creative. They open up ecological space. They remove the dominant competitors. They create opportunities for new forms to arise. The most successful lineages after the extinction are not necessarily the ones that were dominant before the extinction. They are the ones that were pre-adapted, by chance, to the conditions that emerged after the extinction. We live in a world shaped by the Cretaceous extinction. The mammals that inherited the Earth after the extinction diversified into the mammals of today. One lineage of those mammals, the primates, led eventually to us. The birds that inherited the sky diversified into the thousands of bird species that share our world. The fish that inherited the oceans diversified into the modern fish fauna. If the Cretaceous extinction had not happened, the world would be fundamentally different. The dinosaurs would still be dominant. Mammals would probably still be small and inconspicuous. And we would not exist. So the Cretaceous extinction, as terrible as it was also the event that made us possible. It is a reminder that the world is not designed for any particular species, that the future does not follow a predetermined path, that contingency and chance play fundamental roles in the history of life. Now I want to connect the Cretaceous to the modern world in a more direct way, by talking about the animals and plants that are descended from Cretaceous ancestors and that share our world today. Every flowering plant that you see outside your window is descended from the angiosperms that appeared in the Cretaceous. The trees, the flowers, the grasses, the cacti, the water lilies, the orchids, all of them have their origins in the Cretaceous. The flowers that are pollinated by bees are part of the same coevolutionary process that began in the Cretaceous. The bees that pollinate those flowers are descended from bees that co-evolved with the earliest flowers. Every bird that you see is a direct descendant of the dinosaurs that survived the Cretaceous extinction. The pigeons and the eagles and the sparrows and the owls and the parrots and the hummingbirds and the penguins are all dinosaurs, all members of the clade that originated from small theropod dinosaurs in the Cretaceous. When you see a bird, you are seeing an example of the lineage that survived the extinction event that killed all of the other non-avian dinosaurs. The crocodiles and alligators that live in the rivers and swamps of the world today are descended from the crocodilians that lived in the Cretaceous. They have changed little in the hundreds of millions of years since the Cretaceous, retaining a body plan that was already successful in that ancient period. The lizards and snakes that are found in deserts and forests and grasslands around the world are descended from the reptiles that lived in the Cretaceous and survived the extinction. The mammals that we are, the primates that led to humans, are descended from the small mammals that survived the Cretaceous extinction in the shadows of the dinosaurs. We carry within ourselves the characteristics of those ancient survivors: the capacity for thermoregulation, the adaptability, the ability to feed on a variety of food sources. We are walking examples of the long history of life, carrying in our bodies the consequences of events that happened millions of years ago. The lesson of the Cretaceous, then, is a lesson about deep time, about the vastness of history, about how the present emerges from the past. We live in a world that was shaped by events that occurred in the distant past. We owe our existence to the survival and success of lineages that were small and inconspicuous and that lived in the shadows of more dominant forms. We owe our existence to an extinction event so severe that it killed off most of the dominant life forms. This is the story that the Cretaceous tells. This is the inheritance we have received from that ancient period. Let me address one more aspect of the Cretaceous that is often discussed: the climate analogy to the future. The Cretaceous, with its warmth, its high sea levels, its lush vegetation, is often held up as a model of what Earth might be like if climate change continues unchecked. How should we interpret this comparison? The first thing to understand is that the Cretaceous climate was indeed very warm, very different from the climate of today. Global temperatures were several degrees higher. The poles were warmer. The sea level was higher. The distribution of climate zones was different. All of these differences are well established and well documented from the fossil record and from geological evidence. The second thing to understand is that the climate of the Cretaceous was achieved through a different mechanism than the climate change we are causing today. The Cretaceous warmth was driven by high atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, yes, but also by the positions of the continents, the ocean currents, the volcanic activity, and many other factors that are unique to the Cretaceous. You cannot simply take the Cretaceous as a model and say, this is what Earth will be like at 2 degrees of warming, or this is what Earth will be like if carbon dioxide reaches 600 parts per million. The relationship between carbon dioxide and climate is not linear, and the geographic and oceanographic configuration of the Cretaceous was very different from today's. The third thing to understand is the timescale of change. The Cretaceous achieved its warmth over millions of years. Life had time to adapt, to migrate, to evolve new forms suited to the new conditions. Climate change today is happening over decades and centuries, orders of magnitude faster than Cretaceous climate change. Ecosystems adapted to the climate of the Holocene, the last 10,000 years of relatively stable climate, are not pre-adapted to change at this pace. Many species will not have time to evolve or migrate before their habitats become unsuitable. This makes the current climate change much more dangerous than the gradual climate change of the Cretaceous. But the comparison with the Cretaceous has some value. It shows that the planet can survive with a very different climate and still support abundant and diverse life. It shows that vegetation can grow in conditions very different from today. It shows that the world does not become a lifeless wasteland if temperatures rise by several degrees. The Cretaceous demonstrates the resilience of life, the capacity of ecosystems to adapt, the possibility of thriving in a warm world. But that resilience has limits. When change is very rapid, when many species face unsuitable conditions at once, when the supporting infrastructure of ecosystems begins to break down, resilience can fail. The Cretaceous extinction demonstrates this as well. When the change was suddenly catastrophic, when the darkness and cold lasted for months, when the food chains were broken in days, life did not adapt smoothly. Most species died. The resilience of life is remarkable, but it is not infinite. It is stretched to the breaking point by changes that are rapid enough and severe enough. The final lesson of the Cretaceous is a lesson about the vastness of time and the irrelevance of human concerns to that vastness. The Cretaceous lasted 79 million years. 94 million years have passed since the Cretaceous ended. 4 million years ago, the earliest members of the human lineage were just beginning to diverge from our primate cousins. The age of human civilization is a few thousand years at most. The age of industrial human civilization is 200 years at most. In the context of the Cretaceous, these timescales are nothing. They are less than the blink of an eye. The 94 million years since the Cretaceous ended is more than 20,000 times longer than the entire history of human civilization. The changes that happened in the Cretaceous, the evolution of the flowering plants, the evolution of birds, the diversification of dinosaurs, all of these happened on timescales that are incomprehensibly vast from our human perspective. And yet, from the perspective of deep time, the changes happen very fast. A period that lasted 79 million years seems like an instant when set against the 4.5 billion year history of Earth. The extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous happened in what would have seemed like the blink of an eye geologically. It took weeks or months, not longer, though to the animals living through it, it was the apocalypse. This perspective on time is difficult to maintain in our consciousness. We are creatures of the human timescale. Our lives are measured in years or decades. Our memories of history go back a few generations, a few centuries at most. The idea of 79 million years, or 100 million years, or a billion years, is something we can calculate and understand intellectually, but we cannot really feel. We cannot really grasp, in our bones, what that duration means. And yet, the attempt to grasp it, the effort to stretch our understanding across deep time, is one of the most profound intellectual exercises a human being can undertake. It changes how we see the world. It changes how we see ourselves. We are part of a vastly longer history than we usually acknowledge. We are the custodians of a world that has been shaped by events so ancient and so vast that they are almost incomprehensible. And we have the privilege, and perhaps the responsibility, to understand that history and to be shaped by that understanding. Let the Cretaceous become part of your consciousness tonight. Let its vastness, its richness, its strangeness, its beauty sink into your mind as you fall asleep. Let it remind you of the depth of history that lies behind every moment of your life. And let that knowledge bring you peace, the peace that comes from understanding yourself as a small part of an incomprehensibly vast and ancient world. If this journey accompanied you tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the darkness.